This video lesson is about finding midpoints of segments. In this very first example, you're asked to find the midpoint of segment AB. So I hope you recognize that as segment notation when we see the bar that goes over the letters A and B and it doesn't have arrows at either end. All right, we're going to do this example graphically, and graphically this won't be too difficult. Later we'll look at an example algebraically. So again, just like we did a minute ago, finding the distance between A and B, or the length of segment AB, we're going to look at our change in X and change in Y again. And this is the same segment from the last example. So we said our change in Y was 2. That's our change in Y. I'm going to write that out here. And our change in X from A to B, so change in X, is 6. Okay, so we discovered that in the last problem, or in the last example. So when we're finding the midpoint, and I deliberately chose an easy example for this video, the midpoint we know has got to be the point that's exactly halfway between A and B. So we should be looking for it over here somewhere. I'm looking for a point that will basically cut segment AB into two congruent segments. So if we look at our change in X and change in Y, it's really, to find the midpoint, it's as easy as just dividing those numbers by 2. So if my change in Y was 2, I want to actually cut that number in half, and I want to look at this coordinate right here. So I want to look for a point that's going to have a Y value of 3. And instead of being 2 units away from A or B, it's only going to be 1 unit away. And then same for my X values. So I want to go over here and find the midpoint essentially of this segment. And it's going to divide this into 2 smaller segments of 3 and 3 instead of 6. And then where these 2 points converge is going to be our midpoint. All right, so when I ask you to find the midpoint, you can plot it, but I'd also like to know the ordered pair. So our midpoint is located at 1, 3. All right, we've got 2 more examples, and they should go a little faster. In this next example, we are asked to find the midpoint, and although it doesn't specify it, we're finding the point between points G and H. So I might ask you to find the midpoint of segment GH, but I might also just ask you in this language. And I want to give a shout out to Mr. Obuike because he actually taught me this method last year, and I think it's the easiest way to do it. So if we're finding the midpoint of G and H, these are both end points. So G is an end of the segment and H is the other end. And it's actually really easy to do this without a graph. So I'm going to write here the words end, and then I'm going to write midpoint, and then I'm going to write end again. Okay, this is going to be a lot like our last method. So if I take either point G or point H, it doesn't really matter, but I'm going to put one of my endpoints here. So I'm going to say -3, 1. And then I'm going to put my other endpoint down here. So 6, -5. All right, so let's look at, just like we did before, kind of our change in X and our change in Y. Let's look at that from our endpoints. So from -3 to 6, we're increasing, so that's a positive change, and we're increasing by 9. And then from our Y side, from 1 to -5, that's a decrease. We're going from a positive to a negative number, and that's going to be a decrease of 6. So what we're going to do here is just split these 2 numbers in half. Now, let's do the y side first because the 9 is going to give us a decimal or fraction. So instead of subtracting 6 from 1 to get 5, let's just subtract 3. So 1 minus 3 is going to give us negative 2. And then let's check ourselves. If I subtract 3 more, I should get to negative 5. And that's correct because negative 2 minus 3 more is negative 5. So again, we got that 3 by just dividing the 6 by 2, negative 6 by 2. So let's do the same with 9. Half of 9 is 4.5 or 4.5. So if I add that to negative 3, I'm going to use the decimal form. So if I add 4.5 or 4.5 to negative 3, I'm going to get positive 1.5. And then let's just check ourselves. If I add 4.5 to 1.5 or 4.5 to 1.5, oops, sorry, my addition symbol didn't come out there. All right, so 1.5, when I add 4 to that, I get 5.5, and then the other half brings us up to 6. So that checks out. So what we've actually done here is we found the midpoint this way. So our final answer to this question is that our midpoint is going to be at the coordinate 1.5 or 1 5/10 or 1.5, however you want to say that, comma, negative 2. So in this last example, we're given a midpoint and we're given an endpoint. So instead of finding a midpoint, you're being asked to find the other endpoint. And again, this can be tough to do when it's not graphic, so when we're not using a graph. But we're going to go back and we're going to use Mr. Obuike's method that we use in example 4. And it's pretty much the same thing. It's just a different piece of information. So just like we did before, I'm going to write the words end, right, ends down here. And in the middle, I'm going to write mid or midpoint. I'm just going to write mid this time. All right, so let's fill in what we know. We actually already know the midpoint. We know the midpoint is negative 2, comma 5. And we know one of the endpoints. And it doesn't matter where we put this information. If it's at the top or at the bottom, it'll work either way. Okay, so what we're trying to find is the other endpoint. This is going to be really similar, maybe even easier than the last example. All right, so let's look at our change in x here. Remember, this is our x and this is our y. So from 5 to negative 2, I am decreasing on the number line, and I'm decreasing by 7. So that's going to be a change in negative 7. So what we're going to do here is from this midpoint to the other endpoint, we're going to repeat this. This might look familiar to you from some things you learned in algebra. So we basically have a constant rate of change here in our x column and a constant rate of change in our y column. And remember, we associate that idea of constant rate of change with lines and things that are linear. So there are some really good connections here to what you've learned in Algebra 1. All right, so when I subtract 7 from negative 2, I get negative 9. So it becomes more negative. So that's our x-coordinate of our other endpoint. Let's look at our y values. From 1 to 5, we are increasing by 4. So we're just going to increase by 4 again. And when I add 4 to 5, I get positive 9. So we have done it. That is our other endpoint. Our other endpoint is at negative 9, comma, positive 9. And if you want to check your work to this problem, a great way to do it is to graph those 3 points. Congratulations, you made it to the end of the lesson.